Good evening, everyone. Welcome to TEDxMileHigh 2020 Rise. I'm Jeremy Duhan, the curator, and it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. 10 years into our existence, we find ourselves in unprecedented times. While we wish we could all come together in person, we've worked hard to bring the ideas and experiences to you virtually. If you don't know much about us, we're all about spreading big ideas and building community. And I want to thank you for being a part of this creative movement. Now, think of the last time you fell down. What did it take to regain your step? How did you summon the energy to get back on your path? Today, we'll consider the part of each of us that wants to rise. Our nation was founded on systems that were never intended to serve everyone. As more and more of us realize this, momentum is building. Ideas can shift our thinking and reveal our blind spots and biases. They give rise to movements and can connect us in ways previously not possible. Now, to be fair, ideas alone cannot change the world. They require a courageous community ready to listen and translate the ideas into action and change. They require us to look beyond the status quo to see what else is possible. They beckon us to challenge the spaces where injustice exists, to develop new systems and new ways of being. Ideas alone cannot change the world, but they give rise to everything. A new time is unfolding, and it's asking each of us to rise. Today, you'll hear from leading thinkers and doers at the edges of different fields and forces who weave together what we know and what we can do into new visions beyond our current imagination. As we travel with them, consider their ideas, their stories, and how they rise. Our nation faces several crises today, but at the same time, ideas, new and old, are rising. Today, we'll explore how to support their trajectory into movements of positive social change. Let us get started. Now, most of us watch our fair share of TV, but do you ever wonder how different shows and movies influence us? Up first is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado Boulder. She studies the role of the past in shaping the present. Here is Sarah Kurnick.
A few years ago, a stranger sitting next to me on a plane asked what I did for a living. I told him that I'm an archaeologist and I study the ancient Maya. He said, "Wow, I love archaeology," and told me how excited he gets when hearing about new finds. Then he told me how amazing it is that aliens from the planet Nibiru had come to Earth and established the ancient Sumerian culture in Mesopotamia. I have these conversations a lot on planes, in bookstores, and in bars. People want to talk with me about pseudo-archaeology, something that seems like archaeology, but isn't. It involves making wild and unproven claims about the human past. Things like aliens built the pyramids, or survivors from the lost continent of Atlantis invented hieroglyphic writing. Now, most of us know that claims like these are unfounded and frankly absurd, yet they're everywhere. They're on TV shows, in movies, and in books. Think of the History Channel series Ancient Aliens, currently in its 15th season, or of the most recent Indiana Jones movie about the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, or Eric von Daniken's classic book, Chariots of the Gods, which has sold over 70 million copies. Here's the crucial question. Who cares? It's just entertainment, right? Isn't it a nice escape from reality and a fun way to think about the world? It's not. Most pseudo-archaeology is racist and xenophobic. And like other forms of entertainment, it influences our culture in real ways. Let me give you an example. It's common to hear pseudo-archaeologists claim that groups like the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Maya accomplished incredible things, but only with the help of outside groups, like aliens or people from Atlantis. What you rarely hear is pseudo-archaeologists claiming that, say, Romans had help building the Colosseum or that Greeks had help building the Parthenon. Why is that? For pseudo-archaeologists, Europeans could have accomplished their feats on their own, but non-Europeans must have had outside guidance. Claims like these are not just outrageous, they are offensive. Here and in so many other instances, pseudo-archaeology sustains myths of white supremacy, disparages non-Europeans, and discredits their ancestors' achievements. I've spent the last 12 summers doing archaeological fieldwork in the Maya area. Several years back, I was staying in a small village along the Belize-Guatemala border. I spent day after day in the lab staring at tiny, brown, eroded pieces of ceramics. The Maya man who lived across the street made slate carvings to sell to tourists. He'd stop by every once in a while to chat, and one day he brought over a slate carving, and it was this image. The image carved into the sarcophagus lid of the Maya king Pakal around his death in 683 AD. This image is incredible and it's complex. It shows the deceased king rising from the jaws of the underworld to be reborn as a deity. In the center is a stylized world tree that extends from the underworld through the realm of the living into the upper world. Around the edges is a sky band with symbols for the sun, moon, and stars. I was so excited to talk with my neighbor about ancient Maya religion, cosmology, and iconography. Instead, he wanted to talk about an Ancient Aliens episode he had seen, the one about the Maya. And he told me that this image was of an astronaut at the controls of a rocket ship. I was shocked. Instead of marveling at his own ancestors, he was in awe of a fictional alien. He even told me that one day he hoped to give this carving to Eric von Daniken, father of the Ancient Aliens phenomenon. Pseudo-archaeology undoubtedly harms its subjects, often indigenous people like the Maya, but it also harms its viewers. It harms all of us. Like other forms of racism, it exacerbates inequality and prevents us from appreciating and benefiting from human diversity. What's really scary is that pseudo-archaeology is a small part of a much bigger problem. It's just one example of people getting history wrong on purpose, of people knowingly changing historical and archaeological facts. Why would anybody do that? Often, the past is knowingly changed either to justify racism in the present or to present a nicer version of history, a version of history that we can all take pride in. 6 years ago, Jefferson County, Colorado, became a battleground over how to teach American history to high school students. The advanced placement curriculum had been expanded to include things like the removal of Native Americans to reservations and the rise of extreme economic inequality. Members of the local school board were upset. They vigorously protested the changes, arguing that the new curriculum didn't do enough to promote patriotism, capitalism, or American exceptionalism. Right now, we are in the midst of a heated debate over controversial figures, public monuments to controversial figures, people like Robert E. Lee and Christopher Columbus. Should these monuments be left as they are, destroyed, or put in museums? And what should happen to the protesters who deface these monuments? Should they be praised for helping debunk myths of white supremacy? Or should they be punished for vigilantism and lawlessness? What do we make of scenes like this? For me, debates about history curricula and public monuments suggest similar messages. First, the past is political. What we choose to remember and forget relates directly to current political concerns. Second, we need to consider who presents history, who chooses the content of history textbooks and the subject matter of public monuments. Imagine how our understanding of history might be different if it was told by the marginalized rather than the powerful. We can help combat racism and xenophobia today by changing how we think about the past. Archaeologists need to do two things. First, we need to make our discipline more inclusive. We need to work with and for the descendants of the people we study. Richard Leventhal's work at Teosuco, Mexico is groundbreaking, pun intended. For over a century, foreign archaeologists have traveled to the Maya area to excavate the things they thought were interesting, mostly temples and pyramids. Leventhal took a different approach. Instead, he asked the contemporary Maya of Teosuco what they thought was interesting. And it turns out they didn't particularly care about temples or pyramids. They were interested in the caste war, a major but understudied colonial period Maya rebellion. Second, we need to make archaeology more accessible. The last time I walked into a bookstore, I asked where I could find the archaeology books. The clerk took me to a section labeled Ancient Mysteries and Lost Knowledge. It had books with titles like Extraplanetary Experiences. And what is absolutely absurd about this is that real archaeology, archaeology based in scientific facts and historical context, is fascinating. You don't need aliens to make it interesting. It's up to us archaeologists to find new ways to share our work with the public. And this used to be the norm. In the 1950s, there was a game show on CBS called What in the World? The host would present an object, an artifact, and the archaeologist contestants would try to figure out what this thing was and where it was from. The show was funny and interesting and exposed viewers to the diversity of human cultures. Beginning in the mid to late 1960s, archaeology changed focus. Instead of concentrating on public engagement, archaeologists began working together to professionalize the discipline. On the plus side, we now have things like Bayesian analysis of radiocarbon dates and theoretical approaches like the new materialisms. But in the process, archaeology left the public behind. Shows like What in the World became less common, and pseudoarchaeology emerged to fill the void. But we can all contribute to changing how we think about the past. When you see a pseudo-archaeological claim, be skeptical. And know that if you post about Atlantis, tweet about ancient aliens, or forward a clip from a pseudo-archaeology TV show, even if it's not your intention, you may be promoting racism and xenophobia. Also know that the past is alive. It is political, it is ever changing, and it influences our daily lives in meaningful ways. So the next time that you watch the History Channel, read an archaeology book, or see a public monument, remember that every statement about the past is a powerful statement about the present. Thank you.
There's been a lot of debate about diseases like COVID-19 once they arrive, but we don't always consider the source of the problem. Up next is the chairman of the scientific board of Save the Elephants. He's also a professor at Colorado State University. It's a pleasure to have here today George Wittemyer.
Who is to blame for the COVID-19 pandemic? It's a critical question in the face of a trillion-dollar catastrophe. This pandemic was not some act of God. It wasn't even unpredictable. Like many of our most notorious diseases, COVID-19 happened primarily because of us, because of humans, because of our actions and decisions, but probably not in the way you think. It wasn't engineered or manufactured in a lab. It wasn't caused by the Chinese government's attempts to hide the virus. Those are critical factors on why we're experiencing millions of cases, hundreds and thousands of deaths, and severe economic and social disruption. But they didn't cause the virus's emergence. The virus came from wild animals spreading to people because of our behaviors that put us at risk. That's why only we can make sure this doesn't happen again. I'm a conservation biologist focused on wildlife protection. Much of my work is concentrated in Africa on elephants. In addition to gaining deeper understanding of these magnificent creatures, I work to stop the illegal trade in ivory that's decimating this species. We put in enormous effort, money, and even human lives into trying to stop poaching. But to save elephants, we need to stop the causes of poaching, and that's the demand for ivory. This recipe is as true for elephants as it is for diseases. We need to move beyond treating symptoms and start examining the underlying causes if we're to stop outbreaks from happening in the first place. So, you might be asking yourself, why am I up here speaking to you about COVID-19? Well, it turns out COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease, meaning it comes from animals to people. And this is the genesis of the majority of emerging infectious diseases globally. HIV, Ebola, even the plague and Lyme's disease, all of which have and continue to kill millions. These diseases jump from animals to people through interactions, particularly the exposure to bodily fluids. And I'm not talking about the random stranger that kisses the mouth of my poop-eating dog, though that is highly questionable for so many reasons. It's exposure to the blood, saliva, and feces of animals, getting bitten or scratched by animals, and even eating them. And that might sound shocking, but it turns out these types of contacts are happening every day all over the world. When we bring thousands of animals together as we raise and slaughter livestock, when we capture, buy, and sell wildlife, and when we destroy wildlife habitat, pushing animals towards our cities in their search for food and shelter. COVID-19's notorious epicenter in Wuhan was a wet market. This is a grocery store that sells and slaughters live animals. And I'm not talking about lobster tanks, but civet cats and rodents and all sorts of species that would normally never come in contact with each other in the wild. Yet there they were, locked in cages, stacked on top of each other, allowing easy exposure to bodily fluids and whatever pathogens they may have been harboring. All while people were meandering about nearby shopping. These are prime spillover conditions. And before we point our fingers at China, I want to be clear that this is happening all over the world. We're all complicit. In fact, do you want to guess what is considered to be the #2 destination for illegal wildlife? It's the United States of America. By moving animals around the world in stressful conditions, the wildlife trade is a key contributor to zoonotic disease emergence. Every step of the commodity chain, exposure, more and more exposure happens. As we bring different species that never would come in contact in the wild together, and humans come in contact with that strange mix of animals. This gives pathogens a perfect opportunity to jump between individuals, across species, and to us, that they naturally would never occur. A recent study on coronaviruses, yes, the same family as COVID-19, in the live rat trade, a common food in Vietnam, found that about 20% of rats were infected at the time of capture. By the time they were sold to consumers, 55% of rats were infected. The wildlife trade, by moving animals around, increases exposure. The animals that we capture for the wildlife trade are often weak, or they become weakened through the process. And that makes them more susceptible to diseases. Multiple Ebola outbreaks appear to have begun when a person found a disoriented great ape and captured it. The poor souls that butchered and ate that animal start the outbreak by falling ill, spreading the disease to their families and friends and coworkers as they're dying. And this propensity to capture sick animals is universal. Here in Colorado, chronic wasting disease in mule deer, which is like a mad cow disease for deer, is found in about 1 to 3% of randomly sampled deer in a population, but 16% of harvested bucks. Luckily, chronic wasting disease hasn't jumped to people. In addition to directly capturing, trading, and eating animals, we're also drawing them to us by destroying their homes. By reducing wildlife habitat, we force animals to move around in search of new places to live. And those can often become our homes, or yards, or schools. Nipah virus, on which the movie Contagion was based, spilled over from bats after the clearing of native forests, the bats' homes, for palm oil plantations. Yes, palm oil, found in every American grocery store, and products like candy, Nutella, chips, soaps, and lipsticks. After losing their forest homes, the bats moved into human-dominated landscapes, and then spillover. And Nipah virus has a fatality rate of up to 75%, far worse than COVID-19. Again, our actions destroying wildlife habitat, causing animals to move, is happening all over the world. From the clearing of the Brazilian rainforests to suburban development right here in Colorado. One of the best ways we can prevent the next COVID-19 is to stop the behaviors that facilitate the transmission of diseases between species and to us. Whether we like it or not, infectious disease emergence is a game of chance, not unlike your favorite card game, say poker or bridge, but probably more aptly like Russian roulette. The animals that we live with, eat, and fight to keep out of our homes and our crops. Think about moles on your golf course. They're constantly exchanging and sharing viruses and bacteria and protozoa and fungi with us. Our actions can amplify or reduce the odds of spillover. Given the costs of losing this game, Why aren't we doing everything in our power to tilt the odds in our favor? Conservationists like myself have been working to protect wildlife and their landscapes for decades. And it turns out these very conservation goals are also the actions that can tilt the odds in our favor. Ending the global trade in mammals and birds is a key first step. The wildlife trade affects all of us, whether we're directly buying and consuming these animals or not. We need to elect politicians that take this issue and science seriously and recognize the fundamentally critical role the US plays in global health and disease prevention. Key individual actions you can take beyond not buying ivory or exotic pets include buying locally, eating more plants than animals, and avoiding products that lead to deforestation, like palm oil. Tellingly, my colleagues and I were not surprised or caught off guard by COVID-19. Rather, we knew our actions were making such a pandemic inevitable. And I know that might be hard to hear, but given the general apathy about infectious diseases and the environmental problems underpinning their emergence, I think it needs to be said. The big worry among many now is not the eventual total case and death count of COVID-19. It's the likelihood that another, more lethal pathogen spills, and not in 10 or 20 years. Right now, when our attention is subsumed by the current pandemic. We are playing the spillover probability game every day and having our complete medical, diagnostic, development, and monitoring capabilities focus solely on COVID-19 does not put the odds in our favor. This pandemic is a wake-up call. While awful, it could have been much worse. The lethality of the first SARS coronavirus was 10 times higher. We are pouring enormous energy and heartache into dealing with the daily threats of COVID. But we also must look at the factors that led to its emergence in the first place. Conservation is about more than just protecting cute animals and beautiful vistas. It's also about protecting us. COVID-19 has shown us viscerally what can go wrong. Now, it's our job to truly invest in our conservation goals, to reduce the odds of spillover, and to make sure we stop the next pandemic before it even happens. Thank you.
As we reflect on George's talk, let's do a quick poll. When it comes to the next pandemic, are you not at all concerned, somewhat concerned, or extremely concerned about the next pandemic? We'll share that via the poll and send you the results once we get those back from you. In the meantime, I want to tell you about our Adventures program. Think of these as cool, creative, cultural adult field trips that connect you to the people and places that make Colorado so unique. Past adventure attendees have learned how to incorporate insects into their diets. They've learned how to shoot and direct short films to learn about the narrative process. And as part of the entire RISE conference, we held 2 adventures, including one hosted by past TEDxMileHigh speaker Jovan Mays called Recollect, the intersection of poetry and grief. If you'd like to join us for one of our upcoming adventures, be sure to join our newsletter or check out our website. And up now, we have a video for you. You'll see a few of these throughout the day. They're videos we find to be beautiful and creative. I want to thank our partners. We're here at the beautiful Sewell Ballroom, thanks to our friends at the Denver Center for Performing Arts. If you want to learn more about this incredible venue, check out their feature in the program. Thank you to our media partner, 9 News, for helping showcase the event. And thank you to our friends at Galvanize. This is our home of the last 5 years and a beautiful campus. And finally, I want to thank the Betcher Foundation for the incredible work they do in the community. And we have a number of Betcher scholars and alumni participating tonight. Our next speaker is no stranger to the TEDxMileHigh stage. He's a founding member of Slam Nuba, the executive director of Shop Talk Live Colorado, and his TEDxMileHigh talks have been viewed more than 10 million times. It's a pleasure to have back to the stage at TEDxMileHigh, Theo E.J. Wilson.
When the American dream does right by the oppressed, it is the only time that it truly exists. The founding documents of this country are fundamentally humanistic. Racism is inhumane. The dream and the nightmare cannot coexist. And when they've tried, historically, Black voices have issued the wake-up calls. The vice of bigotry has weakened this country since the very beginning, and Thomas Jefferson knew this. He even suspected that it could one day doom the very soul of this country. In fact, Jefferson feared that white children witnessing their parents beating their slaves would erode the moral fiber of America and warp the lens through which we view human life if that life came in a different color. In his letter, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson writes, "If a parent can find no motive, either in their philanthropy or self-love, for restraining the intemperance of passion towards their slave, it should always be a sufficient one that the child is present." Now, let's be honest, Jefferson understood this from firsthand experience. He then goes on to write, "I tremble for this country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever." Well, 50 years after the civil rights movement, the cry for justice calls again. 3 simple words: Black lives matter. Not matter more than any other life, but matter at all. The organization of Black Lives Matter is dwarfed in size by the ethos embodied in these 3 words. In fact, it could be argued that Black Lives Matter has been the subtext for every racial justice movement since the time of Jefferson himself. Abolition was simply Black Lives Matter enough to be freed from chains. The civil rights movement was Black Lives Matter enough to be treated equally. The Black Panther Party stated that Black Lives Matter enough to be defended by any means necessary. Can you hear us now? Then why has our cry for help been received as a battle cry? Could it be that the moral fiber of this country is so eroded that it is now the warped lens that Jefferson feared? If God is just, then why can't this country be, even as patriots invoke his name during the Pledge of Allegiance and the national anthem when some of us choose to kneel? Beneath the rhetoric and racial narratives, there are entire human beings still waiting on the dream to do right. Their lives lost in the inhumane mythology of color and the cultural consequences we've artificially assigned to it. Before they were hashtags and picket signs and t-shirts, they were people. This is the story of one such person who's dear to me. This is Alonzo. Alonzo's birthday was the day before mine, so to make us feel special, our moms made us share a cake. He was a kid who always used his fingers for forks and the frosting for Spider-Man face paint. Well, these days, forks are no challenge, but birthdays are kind of hard for Alonzo. See, he hasn't had one since 2011, courtesy of Denver police, who snuffed the candles in his lungs with the taser shock for every year of his life that he breathed. They said that his strength was superhuman, like Spider-Man. An altercation with a zoo rent-a-cop got out of hand. They treated the animals there more humanely. This Black man taking his last breath yards away from African creatures in cages. And I know that there's a metaphor in there somewhere, but all I remember was his name on the news. Wondering why some disturbance in the force hadn't warned me. Wondering if the sound waves played tricks on the air. Wondering if he indeed just walked through heaven's gates while I wasn't the one greeting him there. See, 8 years before, The Denver police handcuffed me to a chair and beat me like I stole the tax dollars I already paid them. My parents' investment in me in their crosshairs. Every gas mile, every meal, every storybook lesson rests in the hands of Uncle Sam's new slave patrol weapons. But when the beast spit you out alive, buried in the sweat from the moments you thought were the last before you died, who teaches you how to deal with regretting survival? When the shame at a second chance got you nearly suicidal, Alonzo, should have been you writing this poem. Instead, I speak the ballad of another dead soldier. In this war we didn't ask for, old as history's pages, you and I, African creatures, born into uniform, doing life in invisible cages. This is the ballad of another dead soldier. When the bullets kept going like their families had to, and ricocheting off the tombstones like keepers' taste buds in the graveyard that sings in my mouth, like I can somehow speak their alternate futures into this one, like somewhere right now, magically, Trayvon Martin is a model. All 6'3" of us now, chiseled frame, standing tall, like the pride of his mama. Beard game on 100, like his daddy. Clean, like Zimmerman's hands had he just followed directions. And somewhere, Oscar Grant is an actor alongside Michael B. Jordan, never knowing that he's staring at his movie reflection, and Fruitvale Station is just another train stop. And somewhere, George Floyd's lungs never paused for a moment of silence. His heart never called in black between the beats. Instead, he screamed, "I can't breathe," from laughter that Christmas when his daughter got licorice stuck in her teeth. And somewhere right now, Sandra Bland just received her first nonprofit grant. She and her fiance expect a child this November, all because a cop swallowed his pride in a Texas traffic stop, in an incident he barely remembers. These are the lives, and Black Lives Matter. The haters never hear past the black, just get triggered from being awakened from their raceless slumbers, content with real destinies reduced to faceless numbers. And somewhere, Alonzo Ashley made it out of that zoo. And 8 years before, I tragically made it onto the news. And this poem was never written, and you're not in these seats, just a candlelight vigil held at my tomb. But for reasons I can't name, I survived. Here to eulogize the fallen, and I must go on, coping with the guilt of being alive. Won't you join me in singing their songs? Our voices ringing out like the Battle of Jericho, into the blue wall of silence falls, into the blue wall of silence falls, into the blue wall of silence falls.
I want to thank Theo for his courage and vulnerability in sharing that powerful piece with all of us. If you want to continue the conversation with Theo, please join him at Shop Talk Live Colorado. Now, we made the decision to hold tonight's event free for all. And an event like this still requires a tremendous level of resources. As a small nonprofit, we rely on the generosity of our community and all of you to be able to provide future events like this and all of our year-round programming. If you're enjoying your experience so far, we invite you to donate $25, $50, or $100. We have an anonymous donor who has agreed to match all donations made today. So your donation will go a very long way in supporting this event. As you're considering that, I want to share about a couple intermission activities that we invite you to take part in. First, I want to thank FEMA for collaborating with us on our first ever virtual exhibit. This showcases the work they do before, during, and after disasters. And we're so grateful for their partnership tonight and for the incredible work they do in the community. I also want to thank our presenting partner, Health One. This company was recently named the top large healthcare system in the country by IBM Watson. With 11,000 employees, they're one of the top 10 corporate philanthropists in the Denver metro area. And we're so grateful for their support of our first ever virtual event. Be sure to check out the interview with Dr. John Hammer of Rose Medical Center in the program within the health menu. Thank you again to Health One. As we all know, we're just 2 months away from the 2020 election. Up next to finish the session is one of the nation's leading experts on election policy and administration. She's also the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute and Coalition. It's a pleasure to have here to finish the session, Amber McReynolds.
Voting can be hard. It's been hard, sometimes painful, sometimes impossible since the very beginning of our democracy. This year and years prior, we've seen voters wait in line for 5, 6, and 7 hours, and the issue hasn't been fixed. Now, some people may see these images and think, how patriotic, how impressive that someone would wait in line for 7 hours just to vote. But to me, it's not impressive at all. It's disrespectful to these voters. Making voting difficult goes against the very core of our democracy. If we could redesign the system to make it more convenient, more accessible, and easier for voters, why wouldn't we? Now, the short answer is political will. Many established politicians would not actually benefit personally from a reformed voting process that's inclusive for all voters. Politicians are the players in the game, but yet they set the rules for the game. Election policy must be about who votes, not who wins. And the more complicated answer is that our voting system and election system in the United States is highly decentralized and inconsistent. Over 10,000 different local election officials administer this process in cities and towns and counties across the country. They might vary in size from 400 voters to 4.7 million. There's also 50 different state legislative bodies that set the rules of the game, and over 50 different chief election officials and entities that oversee those rules and how they're administered. So voting may vary greatly from state to state. Best case scenario, you're in a state like Colorado, and a ballot is mailed to you proactively before each and every election. No bureaucracy, no extra paperwork. The ballot comes, and the government is responsible for delivering democracy to you. Worst case scenario, you're in a state like Missouri, where your options are limited, you have overly restrictive voter registration deadlines, and if you can't get off work, or you don't have childcare, or you're sick, that's too bad if you don't meet the requirements. And most American voters don't fall into the best case scenario. Now, in my career as an elections official for many years, and now leading the National Vote at Home Institute and our work to improve the voting process across the United States, I've talked to thousands of voters about their voting experience and thousands of election officials about the process. I also co-authored a book called When Women Vote that outlines a roadmap and a playbook for how to improve the process for all. And so I ask you, what would you choose? Which scenario would you choose? Now, the 2016 election was the most highly watched, most anticipated election in US history. And yet, only 60% of eligible Americans actually voted. 100 million people, over 100 million people, did not vote in 2016. And when they were surveyed as to why, over 40% indicated it was due to a barrier, missing a deadline, couldn't get off work, couldn't wait in line for hours. If did not vote was on the ballot in 2016, did not vote would have won in a landslide. What we end up with is a system where a minority of eligible Americans are choosing the politicians that make decisions for all of us collectively. Trust in the US government and politicians is at an all-time low, and the ballot box isn't helping. If we can't even cast a vote easily, why would we ever trust the process or trust politicians? We must put voters first. I'll say that again. We must put voters first in election policies, in designing a system. Just ask any successful business. We live in an era of same-day shipping, free delivery, Lyft and Uber, and take-home cocktails. And consumers, especially in the height of the pandemic, are choosing their experiences in the comfort of their home and on their schedules. So why can't we design a voting process that is as convenient as that. Luckily, we don't have to speculate. In Colorado, we've already designed that process, and Colorado is now one of the best states to vote in and also one of the most secure. In 2013, I worked with a group of dedicated leaders to redesign our voting process and pass legislation that put voters first. In Colorado, every voter receives a ballot ahead of each election. They're automatically registered to vote. There's no overly restrictive deadlines. And with Ballot Trace, voters can track their ballot just like they would a package through the process from the moment it's mailed to the moment the election official receives it for counting. Now, that system was pioneered in Denver now 11 years ago. And when we designed it, we were able to reduce our call volume by 70% and infuse transparency and accountability into the process. Now, when you get that ballot at home, you can vote it and then mail it back in or drop it off in person. And if you want to vote in person, you can do that too. And you're not confined to the government-assigned polling places on one day. You can go to any vote center, close to your kid's school, close to work, close to home, and you can do so over a few weeks prior to the election. It's been 7 years since we passed that legislation and implemented that model. And the results are incredible. Colorado increased turnout significantly and now is one of the top states for voter turnout and also one of the most secure. We also saw a reduction in costs. So because more people were voting at home, we didn't need as many poll workers. And we saw that reduced by over 70%. When we went to buy a new voting system, we no longer needed as much equipment out at all the polling places. And instead of spending $150 million on a new voting system, we as a state spent $20 million. We also saw voters go farther down the ballot to local races and ballot issues. And we saw turnout increase on those down ballot races and issues. Those races include mayor, board, and city council. And they also include the really long legalese ballot issues that take forever to figure out. Voters now have a laptop in reach at their home, and they can research candidates and issues on their own time. We also have research now that shows that voting by mail and voting at home makes voters more informed because they have all of that extra time, as opposed to being in person and worrying about the long line of voters behind you while you're trying to rush through. And the final, most important aspect of the results that we've seen out of Colorado is about civics for future voters. And I want to share my story with my 2 elementary children. Every time my ballot comes before each election, one of my kids gets it and they always start asking, when are we going to fill out mom's ballot? We sit down together, they read the instructions to me, they read the candidate names, and they ask me questions like, Mom, what does governor do? What does the mayor do? Maybe I want to be a mayor someday. We research those issues together, we talk about it, and it takes me forever to complete my ballot. But I know that I have created lifelong, civically engaged voters and future voters that understand that the choices they make on that ballot impact their communities and their world. This is the type of voting experience that we want for every voter across the country. Many other states have taken notice, including California, Vermont, New Jersey, Hawaii. All have expanded options for voting at home this year in 2020. Americans are resilient. We need a voting process that is also resilient from a pandemic, from burdens and barriers, from inequities, from unfairness, from foreign adversaries, and from administrative deficiencies. Across the country, voters are choosing to vote at home in record numbers. It is safe, it is secure, and we have built-in security measures to deter and detect bad actors who try to interfere with the process. Today, voting at home means paper ballots, but in the future, that might look very different. Voters deserve an awesome and safe voting experience, free from barriers and burdens. It's the politicians that serve us, not the other way around. You deserve excellence. Expect it, demand it, and advocate for it. Thank you.
Thank you to Amber again for that incredible talk. And while we're reflecting on her message, I want to invite all of you to vote on November 3rd in this important election. We have a poll for you before we head into intermission that we'll be sending out. How many of you plan to vote via mail-in ballots versus a polling station? And how many of you are unsure of how you plan to vote at this time? Once you share your vote, we will send that back to you in the poll. Now, for intermission, you'll have 30 minutes to take in some of the activities we have planned for you through the health menu, including the interview with Dr. John Hammer of Rose Medical Center. We'll be back here 30 minutes sharp for a special performance that you won't want to miss. We'll see you then.